April 7, 1945. Dawn broke over the East China Sea with a thin, gray light, the kind that made the horizon disappear into mist and uncertainty. Aboard the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever constructed by human hands, Ensign Mitscher Yoshida stood his watch on the bridge, feeling the deep thrum of the massive ship's engines through the deck plates beneath his boots. Around him, the crew moved with the practiced efficiency of men who knew they were sailing toward death. The previous evening, April 6th, Yamato had departed from the inland sea through the Bungo Strait, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, the last operational surface combat force the Imperial Japanese Navy could muster. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of the Second Fleet, had reluctantly accepted this mission after direct pressure from the highest levels of the Japanese government. When Emperor Hirohito had asked, during a briefing on March 29th, what the Navy was doing to oppose the American invasion of Okinawa, his question had been interpreted as implicit criticism, a rebuke that could not be ignored. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, resolved to send what remained of his fleet out in what everyone understood would be a blaze of glory, a final gesture of defiance. Yamato was a ship born from Japan's understanding that it could never match American industrial capacity. If Japan could not build more ships than the United States, Japanese naval architects had reasoned in the mid-1930s, then they would build better ones. Design work had commenced in 1934, construction began in utmost secrecy in 1937, and Yamato was commissioned in December 1941, just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. She displaced 72,000 tons when fully loaded, more than any battleship before or since. Her main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns mounted in 3 massive triple turrets, each capable of hurling a 3,200-pound armor-piercing shell more than 22 miles. By comparison, American 16-inch guns fired shells weighing only 2,700 pounds. Her waterline armor belt was 16 inches thick, designed to withstand the heaviest punishment imaginable from surface combat. Yet for all her formidable power, Yamato had spent most of the war in port, earning the derisive nickname Hotel Yamato among frustrated Japanese sailors who watched her sit idle while smaller ships bore the brunt of combat. She had seen limited action at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and had been present at Leyte Gulf, but never had the opportunity to engage American battleships in the kind of surface action for which she had been designed. Now, in April 1945, with Japan's situation growing more desperate by the day, she was being sent on what the orders euphemistically called a Surface Special Attack Force mission, the term special attack being understood by everyone to mean suicide. The mission plan was audacious in its desperation. Yamato and her escorts would transit at high speed to Okinawa, arriving in daylight hours on April 8th in the transport area off the southwestern coast of the island. There, they would attack the American invasion fleet, sinking as many troop transports and supply ships as possible. When their ammunition was exhausted, the ships were to beach themselves and continue firing as long as they had shells. The crews would then go ashore to fight alongside the Japanese army garrison until the last man fell. When the ship captains had been briefed on the mission details on April 5th, the meeting had provoked something close to mutiny. Vice Admiral Ryanosuke Kosaka, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, had flown in from Tokyo specifically to ensure compliance. The captains, assembled aboard Yahagi, unanimously objected, not because they feared death, but because they objected to the sheer folly of sailing in daylight without air cover. Captain Tamichi Hara of Yahagi, one of the few Japanese destroyer commanders who had survived since the war's beginning, later described the mission as like throwing an egg against a rock. The captains argued instead for independent raiding operations against overextended American supply lines. They eventually submitted to their orders only when told this was what the emperor wanted and that the mission would support a massive kamikaze air attack. Each captain was given the option of not participating. None took it. The force had been given as much fuel as was available, though some accounts would later claim they carried only enough to reach Okinawa, a one-way ticket. Yamato had loaded 1,170 shells for her 9 18.1-inch guns, 1,629 shells for her 6 remaining 6.1-inch guns, 13,500 anti-aircraft shells, and 11.5 million rounds of machine gun ammunition. During the war, Two of her four 6.1-inch turrets had been removed to make room for additional anti-aircraft weaponry. By 1945, she carried 12 dual 5-inch gun mounts, 54 triple-mounted 25mm guns, 162 in total, plus numerous smaller machine guns. She had been fitted with multiple air and surface search radars, as well as radio intercept capability. She had suffered minor damage from a bomb hit during American carrier strikes on March 19, but was fully operational for battle. Before departure, the force had put ashore 67 recently arrived midshipmen from the Admiral Naval Academy, though many begged to stay. The oldest and sickest sailors were also sent ashore. Morale aboard Yamato was described as poor, especially after the crews learned they were on a one-way mission. Making matters worse, the ship carried a Nisei radio intelligence operator, an American citizen who had been studying in Japan when war broke out and had been given the choice of execution or service in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He would monitor American communications and understand exactly what the enemy was saying about them. The Americans were waiting. Senior commanders in the Pacific, including Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, knew what Yamato's mission was before almost anyone aboard the battleship did. The execute order for Operation Tenichigo, Heaven No. 1, had been intercepted on March 26 and decrypted by Fleet Radio Unit Pacific and OP-20G in Washington. Over the following days, additional intercepted messages provided increasingly detailed information about the operation's timing, with specific mention of Yamato appearing in decrypts on April 5. The Americans knew exactly what was coming and exactly when. American submarines were already in position as Yamato transited southwestward. At 1,745 hours on April 6, submarine Threadfin sighted the Japanese force as it passed through Bungo Strait and issued a contact report in the clear, a transmission that was intercepted aboard Yamato, confirming what everyone already suspected. At 1830, destroyer Isokais spotted Threadfin on the surface. At 2144, the submarine sent a detailed contact report with an accurate force disposition. Submarine Hackleback then picked up surveillance, issuing 4 contact reports during the night as the Japanese force transited along the coast of Kyushu. Japanese destroyers peeled off 3 times to drive the submarine away, but the forays were brief. They had to keep up with Yamato. The submarine traffic, transmitted in the clear and mentioning Yamato by name, did nothing to improve the sense of foreboding among the senior officers. Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, commander of Fast Carrier Task Force 58, and Admiral Spruance immediately reacted to the submarine reports. Both had access to the ultra-communications intelligence and were expecting the sortie. Mitscher ordered all 4 of his carrier task groups to proceed as quickly as possible to launch positions northeast of Okinawa with the intent to destroy Yamato before she got anywhere near the invasion beaches. Task Groups 58.1 and 58.3 quickly moved into station. Task Group 58.4 had just finished refueling and would arrive in time. Task Group 58.2 was in the process of refueling and would miss the action. Spruance also issued orders to Rear Admiral Mortondeo, commander of the bombardment force, to organize a blocking force of old battleships northwest of Okinawa. During the night, this plan evolved into detaching 6 new fast battleships from Task Force 58. Massachusetts, Indiana, South Dakota, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri mounting 54 16-inch guns among them, plus the battle cruisers Alaska and Guam, 5 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. It was a force more than capable of annihilating Yamato in surface combat. But they would not be needed. As dawn broke on April 7th, a pitiful 6A-6M0 fighters appeared to provide combat air patrol over Yamato. Between sunrise and 1,000 hours, a total of only 14 Zeros would show up, all the Japanese could spare. The American codebreakers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had already intercepted the message stating that air cover would end at 1,000. American commanders knew the precise moment when the Japanese force would be completely vulnerable. At 0657, destroyer Asashimo, with Captain Kataki embarked, signaled that she was experiencing engine trouble and began falling behind. The crew took it as another bad omen. At 0823, a Hellcat fighter from the carrier Essex sighted Yamato. The battleship's lookouts reported the contact at 0832. Visibility was highly variable due to patchy cloud cover, sometimes good, often poor. The Hellcat pilot issued his contact report at 0832. By 0840, the Japanese counted 7 Hellcats circling the force, maintaining a respectful distance. The Japanese fighters attempted to intercept but made no contact before they departed at 1000 as ordered, leaving Yamato and her escorts naked against the sky. With this contact information confirmed, Admiral Spruance ordered Admiral Deo to ready the battleship blocking force. Since Yamato could not reach the landing area before April 8th, there was no immediate rush, and Deo scheduled a planning conference on his flagship El Dorado at 10:30, with plans to sortie Task Force 54 from the bombardment area at 15:30. Meanwhile, aboard the Task Force 58 carriers, strike packages remained ready on deck, fully armed and fueled, while reconnaissance aircraft continued tracking the Japanese force. Not long after the Hellcat sighting, 2 PBM-3 Martin Mariner flying boats from Patrol Bombing Squadron 21, operating from the tender Chandela at Caramaretto, began shadowing Yamato. They maintained discreet contact for the next 5 hours, mostly hidden in clouds, radioing periodic position reports. At 1000, Task Group 58.1, commanded by Rear Admiral J.J. Jocko Clark and embarked on Hornet, began launching aircraft. His group included carriers Hancock, Bennington, and the light carriers Below Wood and San Jacinto. Simultaneously, Task Group 58.3, commanded by Rear Admiral Frederick Ted Sherman and embarked on Essex, commenced launching strikes. His group included the carrier Bunker Hill, flagship of Vice Admiral Mitscher himself, along with the light carriers Bataan and Cabot. Together, the 2 task groups launched 280 aircraft, 132 fighters, 50 bombers, and 98 torpedo planes. For some reason, Hancock launched her 53-plane strike late, and her aircraft never found Yamato in the murk, reducing the actual first strike wave to 227 aircraft. The American aircraft included Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, Vought F-4U Corsair fighter bombers, and Grumman TBF/TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. The Avengers, workhorses of the American carrier fleet, could carry a 2,000-pound bomb or a Mark 13 torpedo in their internal bomb bay. They had a maximum speed of 278 miles per hour and a range exceeding 900 miles, more than enough to reach Yamato and return. The Helldivers carried 1,000-pound bombs and could dive at steep angles to deliver them with precision. The Corsairs and Hellcats, primarily fighters, had been trained in fighter-bomber roles and carried bombs and rockets in addition to their machine guns and cannon. At 1014, lookouts aboard Yamato sighted the 2 Martin Mariner flying boats clearly, and also noted that submarine Hackleback was still trailing. The Japanese had made so many course changes during the night that the submarine had been able to cut corners and maintain contact. At 1017, Yahagi commenced jamming the Mariner's communications, but by then it was too late. At the same moment, Yamato opened fire with several of her special main battery anti-aircraft shells, called Sanshikiden or beehive shells, which worked like giant shotgun shells, each bursting into thousands of steel fragments. The Mariners retreated into the clouds, unharmed. At 1107, Yamato-S Type 13 air search radar detected a large aircraft formation inbound at the radar's maximum range of 63 nautical miles. The radar operators noted the formation splitting into 2 groups. The Japanese force cranked up speed to 25 knots. At 11:15, Yamato-S radar showed the 2 air groups at 44 miles and closing rapidly. A 30-minute delayed report arrived from an observation post on a small Japanese island north of Okinawa. 150 American planes were headed their direction. Japanese lookouts counted 8 Hellcats circling the force with impunity at ranges beyond the anti-aircraft guns, waiting. At 12:10, destroyer Asashimo, still lagging behind due to her engine trouble, reported she was under air attack. Radio transmissions from her abruptly ceased. Aircraft from Bunker Hill had found her first, followed minutes later by planes from San Jacinto, which delivered killing blows with torpedoes and bombs. Asashimo went down with all 330 hands. At 12:32, lookouts in the main force sighted the first incoming strike wave. Captain Hara aboard Yahagi later described the sight as terrifying. Large formations of aircraft circled the task force just outside anti-aircraft range, some rotating clockwise, others counterclockwise, like wolves circling prey. Strike leaders coordinated their attacks and organized into groups targeting specific ships, all free from any interference from Japanese fighters. The coordination was methodical and professional, demonstrating the vast experience American naval aviators had accumulated over nearly 4 years of Pacific combat. At 12:34, Yamato opened fire with her 2 forward main battery turrets, lobbing Sanshikiden shells at the American aircraft. Firing 18-inch naval guns designed for surface combat against aircraft was an act of desperation. The massive shells detonated uselessly in the sky, their fragments nowhere near the agile aircraft. At 12:37, American aircraft commenced their attack runs. Fighters came in first, strafing with machine guns and firing rockets that quickly began decimating Japanese anti-aircraft gun crews. Then came the bombers and torpedo planes. The Japanese opened up with everything they had. The sky filled with tracers, shells, and smoke. To the American pilots, it looked terrifying at first, but they quickly figured out that Japanese anti-aircraft fire was wildly inaccurate. Far more effective was the extraordinary skill of the Japanese ship captains in making violent evasive maneuvers to throw off aim and dodge bombs and torpedoes. Numerous Helldivers from Bennington and Hornet attacked Yamato from her port side. Near misses splashed all around the battleship as she maneuvered at her flank speed of 27 knots. Finally, at 12:40, 2 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs struck home. One exploded in crew quarters. The second hit near the aft command station, knocking out one of her 2 air search radars, the aft secondary gun director, and several 25mm gun mounts. It started a fire that killed all but 1 crewman in the after 6-inch gun turret, a fire that could not be extinguished. 1 Helldiver was shot down. At 12:43, 5 Avenger torpedo bombers from Hornet came in from the port side while 14 Corsairs from Bunker Hill strafed and fired rockets at Yamato. The rockets caused little damage to the heavily armored ship but were deadly to the exposed gun crews. 1 Avenger was shot down, but the other 4 dropped their torpedoes. Yamato's helmsman managed to evade 2, but the third slammed into her port side at 12:45. She quickly shipped 2,235 tons of water, and the ship developed a noticeable list to port. The damage control teams responded with practiced efficiency, counterflooding compartments on the starboard side to correct the list. It worked. Light cruiser Yahagi had steered away from Yamato in a deliberate attempt to draw attacks away from the battleship. It worked too successfully. At 12:46, a torpedo struck Yahagi directly in her engine room, killing the entire engine room crew instantly and leaving her dead in the water, unable to maneuver or avoid further hits. Destroyer Isoke's rushed to Yahagi's aid to rescue Rear Admiral Komura, but was pummeled by bombs before she could get close. Meanwhile, about 34 Hellcats and Corsairs and 22 Helldivers and Avengers worked over the other Japanese destroyers. A near-miss disabled Hamake's starboard shaft, slowing her. At 12:47, torpedo hits amidships blew her in half. A 500-pound general-purpose bomb struck Suzutsuki and blew off her entire bow. Futsuki was hit by 2 rockets that turned out to be duds. The first American attack wave ended around 12:50. At 13:02, Yamato's remaining air search radar detected a second inbound wave. These were 50 aircraft from Essex and Bataan. At 13:22, a Corsair from Essex hit Yamato in the port bow with a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb. 12 Helldivers claimed several hits in the bridge area in exchange for 5 Helldivers damaged by anti-aircraft fire. By this point, Yamato was firing her main battery beehive shells set to detonate after just 1 second, about 3,000 yards from the ship, creating a wall of steel fragments that American aircraft simply flew through unharmed. At 13:33, another 110 aircraft from Task Group 58.4, Yorktown Intrepid, and Langley, which had launched after the first wave, commenced their attack on Yamato. This time, following coordinated instructions from strike leaders, all attacks concentrated exclusively on the battleship. 20 Avengers attacked from the port side. Concentrating torpedo attacks from one side was deliberate doctrine, developed through years of combat experience. The intent was to cause progressive flooding that would eventually capsize the ship rather than sinking it on an even keel. 3 torpedoes hit in quick succession. Yamato took on another 3,000 tons of water, and her list increased to 7 degrees. Having already counterflooded to starboard to correct the earlier list, damage control teams were running out of options. The only choice was to deliberately flood her starboard engine and boiler rooms. The desperate measure worked, correcting the list, but there was insufficient time to give adequate warning. Several hundred Yamato crewmen were drowned as a result, killed by their own countermeasures. The flooding also slowed the ship to 10 knots, making her an easier target. At 13:42, another Avenger was shot down, but 4 more torpedoes were already in the water, approaching from the port side. 2 hit. With Yamato slowed and wallowing, American torpedo plane pilots started deliberately targeting her stern to knock out her steering. She became stuck in a starboard turn, circling helplessly. For more bomb hits struck the superstructure area, wiping out many of the remaining 25mm gun positions and their crews. A bomb exploded in the ship's dispensary, killing many of the wounded who had been gathered there along with most of the medical personnel trying to help them. The executive officer reported to Captain Kosaku Aruga that the damage control officers were dead, that counterflooding could no longer correct the list, and recommended abandoning ship. Since Yamato-S radios had been destroyed, Vice Admiral Ito sent out a signal via flag hoist, canceling the operation and freeing the other ships to attempt escape back to Japan. At 14:02, Yamato took 3 more bomb hits amidships. Captain Aruga gave the order to abandon ship. At 14:07, she was struck by at least a 7th torpedo, this time to starboard. At 14:17, an 8th and 9th torpedo, both to port, slammed into her hull. By this point, the uncorrected list was passing 15 degrees to port, and alarms were sounding throughout the ship, warning of critical temperatures in the forward main battery magazines. There were no working pumps left to flood them. As Yamato continued listing to port, her starboard armor belt, 16 inches of hardened steel designed to resist battleship shells, came out of the water, exposing her vulnerable underside. 6 Avengers from Yorktown attacked from the starboard side. Their Mark 13 torpedoes reset for a depth of only 20 feet to strike beneath the armor belt. Several hit. Meanwhile, the dead-in-the-water Yahagi had absorbed at least 12 bombs and 7 torpedo hits. At 14:05, she capsized and sank. Of her crew of approximately 1,446 were lost. Both Rear Admiral Komura and Captain Hara survived. By 14:08, Yamato had clearly begun her final roll. The massive ship was being abandoned, though thousands of men remained trapped below decks. Vice Admiral Ito retired to his stateroom to go down with his ship. Captain Aruga lashed himself to the binnacle on the bridge to do the same. Ensign Yoshida, standing nearby, watched men leap from the tilting decks into the sea. By 14:20, the main deck was vertical. At 14:30, Yamato rolled completely over and slipped beneath the waves. In that instant, the number 1 forward magazine detonated in a catastrophic explosion. The blast was so immense that it was heard and seen 200 kilometers away in Kagoshima. It sent up a mushroom-shaped cloud nearly 20,000 feet into the air. The pall of smoke was visible for more than 100 miles. Yoshida, who had managed to reach the water and was swimming away from the ship, later said the explosion downed several American aircraft that had been observing from close range. More American planes may have been knocked down by the magazine explosion than by all of Yamato-S anti-aircraft fire combined. The most definitive accounts indicate that 3,055 of Yamato-S 3,332 crewmen were lost. According to historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, only 23 officers and 246 enlisted sailors survived. Vice Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga went down with the ship. Both would be posthumously promoted, Aruga to Vice Admiral, Ito to Full Admiral. Rear Admiral Nobuyai Morishida, Ito's chief of staff, was the senior survivor. Of the destroyers, Asashimo had been sunk with all hands, about 330 men. Hamikase sank with a loss of 100 crewmen and 45 wounded. 257 were rescued. Isokase, her steering disabled by a near miss, suffered 20 dead and 54 wounded and had to be scuttled by gunfire from ukikes. Kasumi, her steering also disabled by 2 bomb hits, suffered 17 dead and 47 wounded, and was scuttled by 2 torpedoes from Futsuki. Suzutsuki, despite suffering 57 dead and 34 wounded and having her bow blown completely off, made it back to Sasebo, Japan, steaming in reverse the entire way. She was never repaired. Futsuki suffered light damage from dud rockets, with 12 dead and 12 injured. She was repaired but had her stern blown off by a mine after the August ceasefire. Ukikes suffered 3 dead from strafing and survived the war. Hatsushimo suffered only 3 wounded on April 6th, but on July 20th struck a mine and became the last Japanese destroyer sunk in the war. About 1,620 survivors from Yamato, Yahagi, Hamikase, Isokase, and Kasumi were rescued by the surviving Japanese destroyers. A U.S. PBM Mariner flying boat also rescued several Japanese survivors. Japanese reports would later claim that American aircraft strafed survivors in the water, though they also reported that attacks ceased on destroyers that were picking up survivors. In total, about 1,187 crewmen from Yahagi and the 4 destroyers were lost. Combined with Yamato-'s losses, approximately 4,242 Japanese sailors gave their lives for the Emperor on April 7th. Yamato had gone down more than 300 nautical miles from Okinawa. She had never come remotely close to her objective. The most powerful battleship in the world, mounting the largest guns ever put to sea, protected by the thickest armor ever forged, had been no match for 390 American carrier aircraft. American losses were 10 aircraft and 12 pilots and aircrewmen. The mission had accomplished nothing except to slightly improve the success rate of kamikaze attacks that day by drawing some American attention away from the invasion beaches. Combined Fleet Command sent a message of thanks to the survivors. Thanks to your heroic sacrifices, the success rate of our suicide aircraft improved dramatically. For the men who had survived, pulled from the oil-slicked waters of the East China Sea, watching the smoke still rising from where their shipmates had died, the words must have rung hollow. Operation Tengo represented the last major surface action of the Imperial Japanese Navy in World War II. The fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect in December 1941, that had ranged across the Pacific from Darwin to the Aleutians, that had fought desperate battles at Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, had been reduced to a single battleship and a handful of escorts sent on a suicide mission with no realistic hope of success. The decision to send Yamato had been driven not by military necessity but by a sense of honor and duty, an unwillingness to let the ship sit idle while soldiers and airmen were dying. Admiral Toyota had explained that it would have been a miracle if the mission succeeded, but he would not consider leaving his ships safely in home waters while Japanese forces on Okinawa fought and died. The Battle of Okinawa, which had begun on April 1st with the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater, would continue for another 75 days. American forces, the U.S. 10th Army, consisting of 4 Army divisions and 3 Marine divisions, would fight one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The fighting was so fierce that the battle became known as the Typhoon of Steel in English and Tetsu no Aim, Rain of Steel, or Tetsu no Bofu, Violent Wind of Steel, in Japanese. Approximately 160,000 casualties would be suffered by both sides. At least 50,000 Allied and between 84,000 and 117,000 Japanese military personnel. Approximately 149,000 Okinawan civilians were killed, died by suicide, or went missing, roughly half the island's pre-war population of 300,000. The intensity of the fighting on Okinawa, combined with the fanatical resistance and willingness to fight to the death demonstrated by Japanese forces, would weigh heavily on American planning for the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November 1945, and Operation Coronet, the planned invasion of Honshu scheduled for March 1946, would have dwarfed even Okinawa in scale. Casualty estimates for the invasions of the Japanese home islands ran into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million. These estimates, informed by the brutal fighting on Okinawa, would factor significantly into the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. For the U.S. Navy, the sinking of Yamato represented a validation of carrier aviation doctrine that had been controversial before the war. Battleship advocates had long argued that the big guns were the decisive weapon at sea. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated that aircraft carriers could deliver a devastating surprise attack, but many still believed that in a stand-up fight between a battleship and aircraft, the battleship would prevail. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 and the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 had already begun to settle this debate, but the destruction of Yamato, the ultimate expression of battleship design, removed all doubt. Aircraft carriers were now undeniably the capital ships of modern naval warfare. The Japanese had understood this reality earlier than most. Their carrier strike force had dominated the Pacific in the first 6 months of the war. But the loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway in June 1942, followed by the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, had devastated Japanese naval aviation. By 1945, Japan lacked both the aircraft and the trained pilots necessary to challenge American carrier dominance. The 6 Zeros that appeared to cover Yamato on the morning of April 7th represented not a combat air patrol but a token gesture, all that could be spared from the desperate defense of the home islands. The Americans, by contrast, had built an overwhelming superiority in both numbers and quality. Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mitscher's command, was the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. It consisted of multiple carrier task groups, each built around several fleet carriers and light carriers, screened by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Fast Carrier Task Force had been the main striking force of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific from January 1944 through the end of the war. Its aircraft had ranged across the Pacific, striking targets from the Philippines to Japan itself, achieving air superiority wherever they operated. The pilots who attacked Yamato on April 7th were experienced combat veterans. Many had multiple combat tours and hundreds of hours of flight time. They coordinated their attacks with professional precision, organizing strike groups, assigning specific targets, and executing coordinated bombing and torpedo runs that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. The strafing attacks that preceded the main strikes suppressed anti-aircraft fire by killing gun crews. The deliberate concentration of torpedo attacks on Yamato's port side followed established doctrine designed to maximize flooding and cause capsizing. When the battleship's starboard armor belt emerged from the water as she listed, torpedo bombers immediately adjusted their depth settings to strike beneath the armor. Every aspect of the attack demonstrated hard-won tactical knowledge and operational excellence. For Japan, the loss of Yamato marked more than the destruction of a ship. She had been a symbol of Japanese naval power and technological prowess, proof that Japan could build something larger and more powerful than anything the Americans possessed. Her construction had been shrouded in secrecy, her capabilities exaggerated in whispers and rumors. Japanese propaganda had sometimes referred to her as unsinkable. Her loss, therefore, carried psychological weight beyond her military value. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, one of the few survivors, would spend the rest of his life processing what he had experienced. In 1946, less than a year after the war ended, he wrote an explicit account of Yamato's final mission, but American occupation censors suppressed it entirely for its perceived glorification of the warship. He was able to publish a revised version in 1949, when censorship had relaxed, and a definitive edition in 1978. His memoir, later translated into English as Requiem for Battleship Yamato, captured both the horror and the waste of the mission. He described the intense fighting spirit of the crew, their highest level of training, and an end that knew no shame under heaven. But he also grappled with the fundamental futility of it all. Over 3,000 men sent to their deaths in a mission everyone knew could not succeed. Captain Tamichi Hara of Yahagi, who survived the battle and lived to write his own memoir, Japanese destroyer captain, never wavered from his assessment that the mission had been like throwing an egg against a rock. He had been one of the most successful and experienced destroyer commanders in the Japanese Navy, having survived every major naval battle from Pearl Harbor onward. His survival of Yahagi's sinking was almost miraculous. His account of the events of April 7th combined professional naval analysis with searing personal testimony about the waste of lives and ships in a mission that served no military purpose. The wreck of Yamato rests today on the seafloor approximately 1,200 feet down and about 50 miles southwest of Kyushu, Japan, at coordinates 30 degrees 22 minutes north, 128 degrees 4 minutes east. She is broken in two, her massive hull torn apart by the magazine explosion that marked her final moments. The site is considered a war grave. Japanese commemorations and memorials honor the men who went down with her. In Japan, Yamato has become a cultural symbol, appearing in films, anime, and literature, most famously in the science fiction anime series Space Battleship Yamato, which reimagines the ship as a spacefaring vessel on a mission to save Earth. The historical debate about Operation Tengo continues. Some historians argue that Admiral Toyoda's decision was understandable given the cultural and political pressures he faced, including the implicit criticism from Emperor Hirohito. Others maintain that it was a criminal waste of lives and resources that served no purpose except to satisfy abstract notions of honor. What is beyond debate is that by April 1945, Japan had already lost the war. American forces controlled the seas and skies. Japanese cities were being systematically destroyed by bombing. The invasion of Okinawa was proceeding inexorably despite fierce resistance. No single battleship, no matter how powerful, could alter these realities. The counterfactual question remains intriguing. What if Yamato had encountered the American battleship force that Admiral Spruance had positioned as a blocking force? 6 American fast battleships mounting 54 16-inch guns would have faced 1 Japanese battleship mounting 9 18-inch guns. Yamato's guns had longer range and fired heavier shells. Her armor was thicker, but she would have been outnumbered 6-1, and the American ships were faster. Moreover, the American battleships were equipped with superior radar fire control systems that could deliver accurate fire at long range, even at night or in poor visibility. Most naval historians believe the result would have been the same. Yamato would have been overwhelmed and sunk. But at least she would have gone down fighting the kind of battle for which she had been designed, in the tradition of the great surface actions of naval history. Instead, she was destroyed from the air, never firing her main battery in anger at a surface target, never engaging in the climactic battleship duel that her designers had envisioned. The loss of 10 American aircraft and 12 aircrewmen in the attack was remarkably light given the scale of the operation. This low loss rate reflected several factors: the overwhelming numerical superiority of the American force, the lack of Japanese fighter opposition, the relatively poor accuracy of Japanese anti-aircraft fire, and the skill and experience of American pilots in executing coordinated attacks. Still, each of those 12 American deaths represented a young man who did not come home, a family that received a telegram bearing terrible news. Their sacrifice, though small compared to Japanese losses, was no less real. April 7, 1945, marked the end of an era in naval warfare. The battleship, which had dominated naval thinking for nearly a century, had been decisively superseded by the aircraft carrier. Yamato was the last and greatest expression of battleship design, a ship that represented thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to build a warship that could survive battle and project power across the sea. But she had been rendered obsolete by a technology less than 40 years old. The age of the battleship was over. The age of carrier aviation had arrived. For the men who died aboard Yamato and her escorts on that April day, these grand historical narratives meant nothing. They had followed their orders, fought their ship to the end, and died doing their duty as they understood it. Ensign Yoshida, floating in the oil-slicked water, watching the massive pillar of smoke rise where his ship had been, understood that death had come very close to him but had passed by. He resolved that he would live his life sincerely, that living out life with purpose was the way to face death. It was the only way to honor the shipmates who had not been as fortunate as he. The Battle of Okinawa would rage on for another 2.5 months after Yamato's sinking. American forces would slowly, painfully, grind forward against determined Japanese resistance. Kamikaze attacks would continue to exact a terrible toll on American ships and sailors. When the island was finally secured on June 22, 1945, both sides had paid an almost unimaginable price in blood. The experience would shape the final months of the war and influence the decision to use atomic weapons rather than invade the Japanese home islands. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice. The war was over. The surviving crew members of Yamato and her escorts, scattered across Japan, heard the broadcast and knew that their sacrifice had been in vain. Or perhaps not entirely in vain. They had survived, and survival meant the possibility of rebuilding, of creating something new from the ashes of total defeat. Today, more than 80 years later, the story of Yamato's final mission continues to resonate. It speaks to the tragedy of war, the courage of men facing impossible odds, the futility of fighting when defeat is certain, and the human capacity for both honor and waste. It reminds us that beneath the grand narratives of history, the turning points, the strategic decisions, the technological revolutions, there are always individual human beings making choices, following orders, facing death, and sometimes, against all odds, surviving to tell the story. The wreck of Yamato lies silent beneath the waves, a monument to the men who died with her, and a reminder of the devastating power and ultimate futility of total war. Her massive guns, designed to hurl shells weighing more than a ton across distances measured in miles, never fired at an enemy battleship. Her thick armor, forged to withstand the most powerful weapons of surface warfare, could not protect her from attack from above. She was the ultimate expression of a doctrine that had already been rendered obsolete. Her destruction in less than 2 hours by waves of carrier aircraft marked not just the end of one ship, but the end of an entire era in the history of warfare at sea.